Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this morning's webinar on the hidden email security risks in what passes for the new normal. I'm Alan Calder, I'm your host for today, and the webinar is being delivered by ourselves and by Beyond Encryption, and I'll introduce you to Paul Holland, who's the CEO of Beyond Encryption, shortly. But first, a couple of words on IT governance. IT governance is the main company within the GRC International Group PLC. It's our core one-stop shop for cybersecurity and privacy. We've been in the cybersecurity and privacy business for some 15 years. We've got about 200 people inside the business, about 12,000 customers across the 6 continents. We deliver a vast range of activities from simple publishing through to consultancy, through classroom training, penetration testing, and so on. Anything that organizations need to deal with governance, risk, and compliance, you can get from us. And I've been in IT governance for as long as it's existed. It's a business that started from a book I wrote, and since then I've written a number of others which sit at the heart of a governance and risk management approach to dealing with cybersecurity and privacy. You'll hear from me a little bit more during the course of this webinar, but I'm going to just briefly introduce Paul Holland to you. He'll tell you more about himself, but Paul's the CEO of Beyond Encryption, and with them we're delivering this webinar on email security. So Paul, would you like to just briefly talk about yourself and Beyond Encryption?
Certainly will, Alan. Thanks very much for the kind introduction. Nice to see everyone today. Yeah, so my name is Paul Holland. I'm the CEO and founder of Beyond Encryption. As Alan's already said, we're a Hampshire-based tech firm that sort of specialises in digital security, addressing some of the cyber risks that we'll talk about in more detail later. As far as my own background, I guess I've been in the sector, the online sector, since it sort of almost initially existed in terms of the internet, which makes me feel rather old, but nonetheless involved with a couple of previous businesses that have been involved in the sort of fintech arena that were acquired by some interesting parties on that journey. A fab team based down in Hampshire, small but perfectly formed, but with a punching well above our weight. We sort of deal with some very interesting global institutions as well as a very large number of SMEs across the UK, and of course lots of end consumers, and we'll talk more about specifically one of the solutions that is pertinent to today's topic in the form of Maillock, the sort of secure communication solution. Alan.
So folks, the schedule for today is that we're going to be talking about email threats and incidents that affect organizations. We'll look at how hybrid working requires a new governance approach to security systems and processes around that, implications and effects of data breaches. And most data breaches, one way or another, are enabled by or originate with human error. And we'll look at practical steps that you can put in place to deal with the need for improving awareness and building a genuine security culture. And I'll be dealing with the first of those, Paul with the second and third, and then we'll come back to me for the fourth item on the agenda. So when we get to the end of it, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. Please, if you find that you have questions you'd like to ask as we go through that, do use the chat function or the Q&A function to stick them into the webinar. You've got the chat function sat on your dashboard for WebEx, and then we'll pick up all of those questions at the end of the webinar and we'll go through them. We'll share the questions, and then either Paul and I will be able to give you an answer to them. So don't feel you just have to listen in silence. Whack your question in so that we can deal with it. So email security threats, incidents, how do they affect today's organizations? Let me start with a number of pieces of data which give you a sense of the cyber threat landscape today. Mid-sized businesses are as much as 490% more likely to experience a security breach by the end of 2021 than they were in 2019. That's a staggering statistic, 490% more likely to experience a security breach. We've seen every type of attack grow significantly between 2020 and 2021. Bot attacks are up by 238%, Wi-Fi-based phishing or phishing generally by 203%, malware in cloud applications by 180%, delivered via email, 154% increase, delivered through endpoints devices up by 156%, and insider threats up by 132%. So that's a huge shift in a relatively short space of time in the volume of activity in the cyber threat landscape. And of course, that's driven by significantly the shift to first remote working and now hybrid working. And that means that employees can really make or break an organization's cybersecurity. 31% of workers in small and medium businesses connect to their corporate networks using personal devices, their own, from PCs to smartphones and tablets, and none of individuals' own devices come with corporate security controls or antivirus software. And that typically means that you've got approximately a third of the devices on your network, whether your network's on-premise or in the cloud, which could be infected with malware or could be a means of ingress for an attacker into your network. IT decision makers reported that 66% of them did not provide employees with dedicated work devices. That kind of matches what workers say about how they're connecting into corporate networks. 19% of employers encouraged employees to use their own kit, and 15% of organizations have a strict policy around using personal devices for work, and specifically identified unauthorized devices on the network and booted them off or dealt with them. So that means there's 85% of organizations which have either no policy or a lax policy around people using their own devices to access data on their networks. And that opens up a huge area of vulnerability for organizations. When you look at that in terms of how email can impact security, 95% of online security breaches were the result of human error. And you might go, wow, but I thought phishing was a big issue. And yes, it is. Phishing is a big issue, but the human error is clicking on a link or going to a website that you shouldn't. That's the human error that takes place. You've got a challenge that a significant proportion of your corporate firewall depends on human beings. You've got a fuzzy human firewall that you can't set using artificial intelligence, you can't set using firm rules, you can't be sure will always work perfectly because, hey, you need some emails to get through, and criminals are very good at disguising emails, so you need people to be able to distinguish between good and bad, to discriminate between what should come in and what shouldn't. And so a human being can make mistakes, and that's why human error is your key risk. 60% of organizations train their employees to recognize email threats that could lead to an attack. What about the other 40%? And how good is the training of that 60%? Is it consistent enough? Does it keep track of the changing nature of phishing and email attacks? 46% of executives want more frequent security awareness training for end users, but quite often they fall foul of the fact that end users say, well, I was trained last year, do I really need to do it again? It's boring, I've done it before. So you've got to keep on changing and improving the quality of training so that it stays up to date and keeps people aware of and alert to incoming threats. 39% of executives feel they could lose their jobs over a successful ransomware attack. And of course, that is either immediately or once you've cleaned up, or you simply don't get promotion because you didn't make sure that your team, your people were aware of the fact that there was a danger. You didn't make sure that your incident response training was good enough. It's not just about recognizing an attack and dealing with it, it's also about having an ability to respond quickly and effectively. 40% of organizations experience business email compromise or impersonation. Business email compromise is when an attacker poses as the chief executive or as a trust supplier, but as somebody who is able to execute, to pass an instruction which you as an organization execute. Please send this deposit payment not to that bank address. We've just moved bank. Please could it go to the other bank address? All of those business email compromise attacks cost huge amounts of money, and organizations need to be able to spot those just as quickly as they can spot phishing attacks. And phishing attacks are the area that most organizations worry about. And targeted phishing attacks are increasing the way criminals are going. So clone phishing, copying a legitimate email that's previously been delivered, but sent from a spoof address that closely resembles the email address of the original sender. Changing a letter in the URL. You can buy a URL with a very slightly different email address, a different URL than your target, but which looks to the somebody taking a quick glimpse at it as though it's exactly the same. That means that it's much more likely that the recipient will click on a link or go to the website you've invited them to go to. A spear phishing attack might build on clone attack, but it will be focused on specific people with a specific message. It will be applied for this role. Here's the report that you're looking for. Here's the invoice that you were promised. Here's your new purchase order. Things that people go, yep, thank you. I'm not sure I was expecting that, but that looks good. I'll go for it. And when those are focused on chief executives or people in the C-suite, they're called whaling attacks, because attackers recognize that senior executives often have access to lots more corporate data, lots more systems, and are much less likely to be prepared to undergo staff awareness training and have in place the type of controls that are applicable across the organization. So you go for a senior executive, prey on his or her sense of entitlement, arrogance, importance, or just critical role in the nation, in the organization, to get them to fall for a link. And of course, then business email compromise is going the other direction. It's what looks to be an email from the chief executive to her finance department saying, can you please arrange to pay this new partner the £5,000 today? We need that in place to secure our relationship. Cyber criminals are very sophisticated. They've been at it a long time. They can employ some of the best people in the business. And that means that the work which they do is driven by the same continuous improvement methodologies that we use in legitimate business. Phishing emails, which is the core of our challenge, has got two manifestations. The first is a malicious email attachment, which usually has an enticing name such as an invoice. The attachment has got in it some form of malware, which will execute once you open the malware. The second type of phishing email is one which has a link in it, and the link will either point you to a malicious website, which will look like a genuine website, or might even execute a small piece of code which will start downloading malware onto the system. So two different types of email. People need to be aware not only of the type of email, but also the sophistication which goes into how attackers create and deploy those kinds of emails. And the complexity and virulence of that as an attack means that organizations really do need, particularly in today's hybrid working environment, to think about how to govern, structure, organize, and put in place appropriate security processes and systems that will defend the organization. This is where Paul's going to take over and talk you through the kinds of ways you need to be thinking about these issues. Paul.
Thanks very much, Alan. This is obviously a big area, a big topic, and I guess whilst Beyond Encryption is a SaaS software supplier at the heart of it, what we really are about is trying to protect businesses and their customers from the risks that are associated with sensitive data. And obviously all of the points that Alan's just raised there have highlighted all sorts of touch points for businesses day to day where they are involved with sensitive data, whether that's just invoicing or beyond. And our communications infrastructures, email, are essential to us. So no big surprise to talk about COVID-19. Hopefully everyone's seeing some slight improvements around the situation, but nonetheless, COVID's had a huge impact on the way we are all operating. whether you're a small or a large business. And our usage of digital propositions has sort of increased exponentially given that backdrop of home and remote working. Those changes I can't personally see are likely to change, certainly from a business perspective. We're a hybrid user. I was commenting briefly before, for those that can see us on camera, of Alan's lovely backdrop with his books and my Peloton, which doesn't perhaps get used as often as it should do. But we're all very used to Teams operating online and perhaps being slightly more involved in each other's homes. But that usage, that digital compulsion, has changed things probably forever. There's a number of UK businesses and employees that are now propelled into that world that have seen this transformation is huge. And boards, business boards, are now seeing this as a high priority item on their discussions, including, as Alan's quite rightly pointed out, the need for ongoing training to understand the dynamic and the shift and the changes in this world. Email is the #1 cause of data leaks in 2021, and as you can see there from the stats, many businesses have suffered at the hands of loss of data as a consequence of not taking adequate provisions for that particular medium. The other point, just to touch on here, is we've seen increases in portal usage and a drop in post. I guess it's no big surprise. I was looking at stats just a few moments ago where we've seen sort of the postal service reduced by about a third over the last 4 years. Probably also equally unsurprising is the increase in parcel delivery, but probably Amazon. But nonetheless, this our whole online world is one that is absolutely paramount to all of us. But it can breed very bad habits in terms of how we use portals. We all have a lot of portals, 118 or so, I believe, by statistics, whether that's our home shopping or service providers or BAMR is probably a bad example. And some of that can also breed very poor practices, poor shared passwords, etc. So in terms of that threat of email, well, email is an interesting topic. Love it, hate it, or probably both for many of us. Email usage has continued to see a huge surge. Over 310 billion email are actually sent and received every day. The stats you see on screen there are doing nothing but seeing an increase, and those stats are expected to continue to see that upward curve. Huge volumes of that email traffic, however, as that 60% stat implies, that was actually an FBI stat quite recently, can be fraudulent. So again, being vigilant, ensuring that your employees understand the signs is absolutely imperative. And I guess email is very highly likely to remain prevalent because statistically, again, the DMA published some stats around this recently to say that people use and have maintained in general their same email address for over 10 years. I guess we've all been quite keen to make sure we're still contactable in much the same way as we try and hold on to our mobile phones. So, again, no expectation that those habits are going to change. In one of those earlier slides as well, Alan was talking about those misgivings and some of the acronyms that the industry has started to assign to this type of activity. There are quite a few of them. Alan mentioned business email compromise, sometimes they're called email account compromise, EAC, invoice fraud, authorized payment fraud, home buyer and conveyancing fraud. They used to be referred to sort of man in the middle attacks as well, where these industrial scale businesses globally, their whole raison d'etre, their reason to exist is to survey open email content and try and look into that content and use it in a manner that would be to someone's loss. So whilst email protection is at the forefront of people's minds, and despite the availability of solutions to deal with those inbound threats and risks, in a lot of cases, our outbound interactions with customers and suppliers are neglected. And again, this is where training can help it to a great degree, and where hopefully we can also, like Maillock, help exercise some technology to help with some of those problems, to secure some of that outbound content. Because what we transmit digitally, we are legally obliged to ensure we do so in a manner that is conducive with security, ensuring that data, personal data as it's termed, and sensitive data by the regulator, the ICO, that doesn't fall into the wrong hands and that it reaches the intended recipient. And that's I guess, where the Maillock solution originally was created, to create some ability to access technology that's secure but frictionless and also auditable, what we paraphrase as digital recorded delivery. Because when you're using open email, that information is simply available to be attacked, to be viewed by those cyber criminals. I'm sure we'll all remember GDPR back in May 2018. It feels like a long time ago when it first got implemented. Still considered amongst the sort of world's toughest data protection laws, and we'll see how those evolve with Brexit, etc. But there have been a huge number of fines in that space, over 800 fines in Europe and the UK, and they've ramped up quite significantly in recent months. I think the total sum on GDPR fines levied in Q3 21 hit nearly €1 billion, or use euro for the purposes of this call. That's 20 times greater than the total of Q1 and 2 combined for that same year. And some really big names in there: Amazon, WhatsApp, Google, British Airways, etc. I think this slide was, excuse me. I think that slide was in from your side, Alan, wasn't it? So we'll carry on through, if I may, onto mine. So apart from the sort of negatives, one of the things I just thought we should perhaps bring out here, there are some positives around this sort of digital change environment. Shifting from a paper environment, which has been certainly in a sector that we are so prevalent in, financial services, can have some positive aspects to it. We recently contracted a report by a business based locally that specialises in this area in terms of sustainability, Project Rome, and a guy called Simon Pringle, who founded and runs that business with some fantastic credentials you can see there. The idea for this was to actually start to look at what the actual consequences of digitising our output is, not just from a security perspective, but to look at some of those positives, because it would be remiss of me not to talk during, or having seen the output of COP26, to not talk about how the industry and digitising our output can actually help derive some significant carbon emission reductions, because each ton of post that goes out, and there are huge volumes of this that are going out at the moment, derives about 3 1/3 times as much in CO2 and uses humongous volumes of water from a pollution perspective. So again, it would be remiss not to sort of include a few sort of thoughts around that, given COP26. And actually, when you start to think about digitising output in that way, and the values that the attributes that go alongside of that in terms of security and expediency and all those things, convenience, some of the facts we've seen with COVID and home working, when you see a bubble like that, you may have seen more recently a picture of Trafalgar Square with a inflated balloon that was trying to demonstrate to the world just the sheer enormity, the sheer size of what a ton of carbon looks like. And then when you look at that water piece, well, that water, that 1 ton of post takes 1 1/4 Olympic-sized swimming pools. That's the swimming pool in Tokyo from the Olympics. Scary stuff, scary stats. And of course, as companies start to shift their emphasis towards digital and working from home, that's further accelerated that. These are really important topics. Another one interesting stat, each of us in the UK uses just under 4.5 40-foot trees a year in paper consumption alone. So this whole area is one where digitisation really is starting to provide some plus sides. But of course, in digitising our communications, we need to just take care that we're not opening ourselves up to other threats that are out there. So again, important to just consider how our employees and how our systems can cope with those threats. Just as a point of interest, by the way, this if you've got your phones to hand, or if you just want to take a note of that domain name, it's quite interesting to have a browse on the site there around some stats around this topic. They are quite extraordinary in terms of the sheer volume of trees, hectares of trees that are being hacked down for this purpose. So again, we're really passionate around how technology can be used to safeguard these communications, but also change the way in which we work for the benefit of good, as it were. As importantly, obviously, when these incidents occur, there is that sort of there are other areas of our business and that affect our people that sometimes are also neglected. So I guess we're all very familiar with the impacts of data loss in terms of the GDPR fines that can be levied, our accountability for ensuring that we address some of these issues under GDPR and other areas, and of course the brand reputation. There have been some huge share value slides as a consequence of data incidents in recent years and months. But of equal importance is, of course, the impact on our people, particularly where, as Alan quite eloquently mentioned, human error is one of the primary subjects here, and it's the primary data breach culprit according to the ICO's quarterly stats, even beyond phishing, in fact. So, as I say, important to try and do what we can to ensure that we avoid those other impacts, because they can be significant. The slide you'll see here, I'm just focusing firstly on that little comment on the left. When we were picking up some of the comments here about the psychological effect of cyber attacks may even rival those of traditional terrorism. Excuse me. For me, that you can't help but think, and I'm not sure how many of you may have been watching the Cobra Sky TV program recently with Robert Carlyle as the Prime Minister and Victor Hamilton as his assistant, where they talk about cyber attacks and how that can impact the whole nation. Those sorts of statements are really quite profound, but as more of our information becomes digitized, it can be daunting for an individual to sort of discover that their confidential personal data has been violated by a trusted source. And some of the comments on the right-hand side are actually extracted from actual cases. In one particular instance, where a prominent lawyer has been acting for parties that have been the subject of or included in data leakage. That's a difficult thing to contend with. Again, this leads back into that topic of training, making sure that you do everything you can to ensure that your teams are aware and can spot the signs. So please do bear in mind that it's always worth trying to keep up to date and keep those refreshers in play, because we are in a new norm. Really interested in some of the stats that Alan was talking about there in terms of bring your own devices to work. And a little concerning that whilst people are encouraged to bring their own kit, a considerable number of those devices simply won't carry the right protection software and controls that the corporate would otherwise ensure or insist upon. So whilst it's become a pretty normal culture for people to bring their own devices and use them, many don't discourage that and don't police that activity, which can leave the door open for cyber criminals to sort of penetrate your cyber infrastructure, your digital infrastructure. One interesting example, by the way, in that context, not perhaps where a business that we were involved with, to remain nameless, and we deal with some very large FS businesses in the UK, but even for them, when COVID impacted, they simply weren't ready. Their call centres weren't ready to facilitate their teams working from home, or again, working hybrid. And examples of businesses buying 5,000 laptops and 5,000 mobile phones and allocating them to those teams to try and deal with the fact they were working in an entirely new normal, new way. And all of that creates the other points on there. Longer hours is something I guess we've all become used to during COVID. It's very easy to wake up in the morning and trot into wherever it is you happen to be working and get started, and then find yourself many hours later sort of trundling away. That has its own stresses for people. People's mental health have been affected by the manner in which we're having to work, albeit it can be very convenient for others, and the fatigue associated with that. It's really important to try and take note of those changes, even when we're in a hybrid world as we are today. At the very beginning of that whole COVID piece, we were very conscious of trying to make sure we stayed in contact with people that might feel at a distance from people they were with previously on a day-by-day basis. That has an impact. It has really can be quite dramatic to some people. So, and also just making sure that you're equipping those people with the systems, the connectivity and devices they need to be able to function properly. And again, I suspect many of us have found that trying to kit out people with screens and what have you in both environments, but it's a difficult situation to cope with, despite the fact that for many it might feel like, well, crikey, this is a lovely environment. The truth is it has an impact, and it's not always a positive one. Alan, if I may, I'll hand back over to you.
To deal with these challenges, there are two aspects to how you deal with the challenges that Paul and I have been talking about. One is about staff awareness training. The other is about the technical controls that you can put into how email operates. And I'm going to talk about the staff awareness aspect of that, and then we'll come back and Paul will talk about what you can do in terms of how email operates, because it's the combination of those two aspects that lead to you building the kind of security culture that enables you to avoid the range of challenges and issues and outcomes that we've touched on over the last 20 minutes or so. So staff awareness, why would you implement a staff awareness training program? Yes, you want to build a positive security culture. That's becoming increasingly a basic mantra for all organizations. Cybersecurity is now an everyday headline issue in most general news journals, not just in the specialist press. It makes it onto the list of issues that boards through public companies, through public sector organizations, through private sector organizations are all concerned about. It recognizes, does staff awareness training, that it's employees that can identify and prevent cyber threats. And that fundamentally, if employees are not paying attention, however good your technical controls will be, you're still going to have a much greater level of breaches than you would otherwise. And believe me, however good you do everything, you're still going to have some breaches. That's the kind of reality of cybersecurity today. So what we're talking about is resilience, is defense in depth, is ensuring that if an attack gets past the first or second or third line of defense, you've got a fourth, and ensuring that if it gets through all of your lines of defense, you've got an ability to respond, to recover, and to get on with business as usual very, very quickly. So part of what you want a staff awareness training program to do is not just to provide information about the psychological triggers for phishing and social engineering attacks, to train people, but you also want to test the training. You want to know that after you've exposed the whole of your staff to this is what today's email attacks look like, you want to know that they're not going to fall for them. So you want to do some kind of simulation that enables you in a safe environment to discover whether people have learnt or not, so that you can then follow up and keep reinforcing the message to the point where you eliminate the risk, or you reduce the risk substantially. Remember, you have to be successful 100% of the time. The attacker needs to be successful just once. It's a hell of a combination of risk. Untrained staff are a data breach waiting to happen. Most technical solutions respond after an attack. They'll deal with incoming attacks, but if you've got staff who are going to click on a link or download a piece of email, it may be too late, whatever technical processes you have in place. So training staff on how to identify and prevent attacks is a fundamental component of building a resilient culture. So in thinking about phishing email awareness training, you're thinking about the range of activities. It's not about something like anti-money laundering, where you just need somebody to do a staff awareness training course once a year and you can tick a box that says everybody knows what to do, because understanding of money laundering or bribery are issues which are probably much more widely understood in the business environment than dealing with phishing training is. And phishing evolves so fast that you need a phishing training program. You need to be exposing people on a regular basis to updates in training, updates in information, so that they see the risk from phishing on a completely up-to-date basis. So remember, 90% of malware is delivered by a phishing attack. So employees have to be able to enforce the best practices that you've got. If you eliminate 100% of incoming emails, you will be 100% safe. You'll also be 100% not in business anymore, because you need people to be able to communicate. So you've got to empower staff to recognize malware attacks. Phishing attacks evolve. Attackers use the same kind of software as marketing teams do to improve deliverability of emails. When we send out marketing emails, we want lots of them to get delivered. We really work at making sure we get past spam filters. So do attackers. So there's no question but that mass mailed phishing emails will get through, focused phishing emails will get through, phishing emails that are originated inside a supply chain or a partner of yours because the attacker has been able to take over albeit for a brief while, somebody's email box or email environment, those will get through. So staff have to be up to date with the latest attacks, the latest vulnerability exploitations, the latest style of attack, so that they can say, I know I've heard of one of these, I've never seen it before, but I'm going to be a bit cautious around it. Technology, however expensive, won't do the whole of the job. You've got to marry technology and people. And preventing a data breach is about training staff to recognize what's happening, but also about building incident response so that when somebody makes a mistake, and surely sooner or later somebody will, they know how to report it. Do not punish people who report an incident, because that just means they'll keep it secret, whereas what you really need is somebody going, eek, I've done something I shouldn't have done, and reporting it as fast as possible so that your next line of defense can go into action, your incident response process. So make sure everybody in the organization, top to bottom, anybody who might access email, particularly people who might access email infrequently and therefore are not as aware of the changing scenarios, make sure they're all getting a similar level of training. And build that into a security awareness program, not just a single, you've done the phishing awareness training course this year, so you're immune. That's not enough. You need to be getting staff to do an updated version, probably every quarter, which looks at the most recent phishing attacks that there are. You need to combine with awareness training simulated attacks, which come from genuine URLs which are designed to spoof yours, but where whatever people do is executed in a safe environment, so that you as a client can get a report that says these are the roles or people who did whatever. You can get a breakdown by numbers, by roles, by departments of people who are still susceptible to attacks, and therefore you can focus your continued training on those areas that fall foul of what you're looking to do. We do this kind of thing in IT governance as a standard offering for clients who are aware of the need to deal with cybersecurity. We put together programs which are either off the shelf or which can be completely bespoke. We can build into that games, posters, infographics, newsletters which carry more up-to-date information. We can do surveys and quizzes. We can, of course, share real lessons and real stories and lessons learned around phishing. And the more of the bespoke stuff we do, the more you might want a program which really focuses around how it operates for you as an organization. We do this for clients with thousands of employees, or we can do stuff which is in a more appropriate price bracket for small and medium businesses, which is a combination of off-the-shelf offerings. But it needs to be a program. That's the key message. Cybersecurity awareness, phishing awareness is a training program, not a single course. And so as an organization, you should have a strategy with management commitments to a security awareness program, which recognizes the evolving and changing nature of the risk, and that you have a strategy which perhaps baselines your security awareness, does a survey that says, right, how many people would do the things we don't want them to do today, which has an objective of reducing that over time, and then does repeated training interventions and testing with continual monitoring and refreshing and continual updates to find out the extent to which you've reduced the attack surface. The attack surface is people's vulnerability, their lack of comprehension, and the greater a comprehension they have, the more your attack surface is reduced. So from IT governance, and as I said, Paul's going to talk about the more technical side, but on the training side in IT governance, we have a GDPR email misuse staff awareness course, what's to do with the CC and the BCC lines in an email. There are regular fines now being handed out by supervisory authorities for staff who make the simple error of including 500 client names in the CC list rather than the BCC list, which exposes lots of people to information that they shouldn't get. A complete phishing training program, e-learning around cybersecurity for remote workers, which recognizes the very different environment in which remote or hybrid workers are operating, and therefore the different risks which they have to deal with. All of that can operate alongside simulated phishing attacks built into training programs that enable you to test employees' knowledge. And we regularly find that it takes 3, 4, 5, maybe a dozen simulated phishing attacks over an extended period of time before an organization gets the likelihood of somebody clicking on an email link down into single figures. And it's scary when you see the size, the reality of the extent to which people will still fall victim to a well put together attack, even during an extended training program. So you've got to keep on working at it. And you keep on working at it, and then that takes you to the kinds of areas that beyond encryption, and Paul's going to talk to you about that right now, the ways in which technically allied to staff awareness, you can get yourself secure. So Paul.
Thanks, Alan. I can't reiterate enough actually what you just said. Making this topic real and making it valuable to sort of help your teams deal with the ever-evolving threat is, you might rely on your teams more than you might ever know. So, really worth trying to ensure you help them as best you can understand that threat. As a software solution provider, we have to deal with a very eclectic mix as far as audience is concerned. Right through from global, US-based financial institutions on virtualized environments through to smaller SME businesses. And I always like to cite my mum. My mum is an elderly lady. Thankfully, I've got her using an iPad. She's not going to move away from her iPad and her mail client, but she's as important as anybody else in terms of information that she might receive around investments or whatever it might be. And we provide a kit bag to accommodate those very different actors in the story. As you can see on screen there, it's not unusual for us to be working with smaller businesses that are using the Outlook infrastructure, the Microsoft Outlook infrastructure at the desktop, including Office 365, to enable them to compose content and send it to their end clients. And by the way, also allowing them to reply, because the communications, this is a bi-directional issue, trying to ensure that you're protecting your outbound comms, allowing them to reply to you with equally sensitive information potentially. And one of the recommendations that I'm sure comes out through these training sessions, and you'll see as well, is trying to use two-factor authentication to ensure you've got the right person. All sorts of ways that can be achieved. It may be, closely akin to the experiences we have with our telephony banking systems, 3 questions, 3 answers, or more simply, a code to a phone. All of these different methodologies can be embedded within the Maillock solution so that you can be sure that the person that's opening that correspondence is the person you intended. And of course, we're employing encryption, but as we said before, hence the company name, the solution needs to go beyond that. It's about ensuring this is embedded, operates very simply with little friction, but benefits from that sort of AES 256 military grade encryption. As importantly, I guess from a process perspective, this isn't just about security. This is about process efficiency, even accelerating sales processes, knowing when someone's received something. And this isn't, by the way, the Outlook normal nudge to say, oh, someone's opened your email, because that could have been opened by anybody, as opposed to your target. This is about knowing that an identified individual has met that challenge, is the person you intended, and has opened that content. That's a powerful piece of information. And knowing when they've opened perhaps an attachment, you can't unfortunately prove someone's read something unless perhaps you get them Google glasses, but even that might get a bit expensive. But the point being, that audit is actually suddenly leveraging a technology, email, that's been around for so long, in a way that is simply not been possible before. And of course, those horrible moments, I'm sure we've all had them, when you get a shiver down your spine and think, right, they've just sent that email to the wrong person. If you wrap that into a secure send process through Maillock, you do have the luxury of not just a recall. I'm sure we've all seen the Outlook recalls, and I'm afraid to say I've been the recipient of one where it says, please don't read that email. I'm afraid I'd like to know what's in there, so I tend to read it. This is a proper revoke function, withdrawing access to the keys, the encryption keys, that will allow someone to open the information. So simply withdrawing access. That's a very valuable piece. And engagement. Whilst I've talked about love, hate, or both, emails with us, it's a fabulous tool if used appropriately and if you exercise the right measures on the inbound content, again, that training piece. But what we've seen, in stark contrast to some portal technologies, which tend to read relatively low levels of engagement and lethargy, is that 70% of the information sent out through these mechanisms, because they're using your email addresses, they're not spoofing, they're carrying your livery, they're not carrying hostile content that are filtered by the systems, is that 70% open rate is really valuable and higher in time, of course. So hopefully the system is something that's worth trying out, and certainly whether you use a Malloc or another solution, I'd highly recommend. These are areas you need to consider in your InfoSec discussions on a day-to-day basis.
Grand, thank you, Paul. So that brings us, ladies and gentlemen, to the Q&A section. Here are our various contact details. You can get in touch with IT Governance or Beyond Encryption by any one of those various methods: website, email, telephone, various social media options. And of course, we'll send the slides out to everybody on the call later on today, but this is the opportunity now for questions. So if you do have questions, and we have a few in so far, please do use the chat function. Type your message into the chat box, and we'll pick that up and answer it, and we'll answer it between both of us. So and then when we run out of good questions, we'll end the call. But all in all, we're aiming still to finish by 11:30. So two questions in which kind of go together. How can company mobile devices be set as more secure than using employees' own devices? And if using own laptops but connecting on a remote connection, is this still less secure than company equipment? So I'm going to answer that from a generic point of view, and then I suggest that Paul answers it from a specific email point of view. So from a generic point of view, using employee devices means that other people can also use those devices. They could be shared. The employee on their own device may well have loaded games, applications that could be infected. They may have malware already on their device. And the fact that you're allowing what could be an infected device, or a device which could be infected because other people can access it or use it, means the likelihood of malware finding its way onto your corporate network is by definition substantially greater. With a corporate device, you're able to lock down the tabletop, what kind of device, what kind of applications people have. You can put place to control that. You can limit who has access to it by insisting that only a named user with perhaps two-factor authentication is able to access it. So you can reduce the likelihood of the endpoint device itself being infected. And that means that the risk of employers using their own device is significant. You can reduce that by taking control of their devices, by putting their devices onto your mobile device management platform, but you have to have a policy in place to do that. There can be issues with staff around how that operates. You could simply have all of the work which they do for you done in a restricted cloud environment. There are technical solutions that you can put in place to limit your exposure to what else is on an employee's own device. The one thing you can't do necessarily is control the security of their connection. If they're connecting through a router at home, there's every possibility that they've never changed the default password on the router. The fact that there is a default password means that everybody knows it, and that means that people who want to connect to your router, particularly if there is a known vulnerability in it, can do so. And if they can connect to your router, they connect to all the devices on it, which gives them an insider's opportunity to get malware onto your staff's devices. So, frankly, using staff devices from home is a massive exposure. It has to be very high on your risk register in today's hybrid and remote working environment, and you need to be putting policies and procedures and technical steps in place to deal with that. Paul, would like to talk more about the specific ways in which, from an email perspective, people can limit their exposure to risk in this environment.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, there are a multitude of systems that you can employ, aside from the Malloc piece, as I say, in terms of your outbound comms and reply path. I mean, obviously, these days, data leakage prevention systems and anti-malware, et cetera, you know, there are a whole suite of software solutions that you can use in that perspective. And I think the word you used there, which I think is important, Alan, was control. The company is responsible for its data, its activity, its employees' activity. And of course, when you open up that control by way of forcing a wedge into your infrastructure, which might be a bring your own device to work type situation, what you're doing is opening up that level of control to a degree that might leave you susceptible to inbound threats. And unfortunately, there's simply no way of really controlling that device in terms of what might change each time that person strolls home and heads back in, having installed what they think is a great app the following day, which happens to carry some malware. So I think you've just got to keep that word control in your head, and try and employ systems and that exercise that control. Policies is another word you use, which is a great one. I think these days, if you're running on a decent infrastructure, it's possible to employ incrementally systems that can allow you to implement policies to try and trap out those sorts of behaviours in terms of people connecting devices perhaps to networks they shouldn't be, or using devices they shouldn't be. But if the device isn't owned by you and isn't part of that security policy system, you simply aren't in a position to necessarily remove it if you have a sudden incident. So I think you're absolutely right, Alan. It's one to be avoided, or certainly have on your register and ensure you're cognizant of the risks attached to it.
Are there particular ways in which MailLock can help clients stay secure in this kind of remote working environment?
Yeah, I mean, so as opposed to employing VPN services, sort of virtual private networks, I saw there was another question that came up about sort of remote connections and company equipment. MailLock is trying to employ encryption that's applied at the point of send, but again, can be controlled by the company through gateways and mail policies, email policies, those sorts of things. So potentially removing the ability for an individual to decide when an email has to be encrypted, and using the intelligence within the systems to determine if there's an attachment, if it's an external email party, if there are certain words within the email, using the system to nudge either remotely, automatically, or at the desktop, provide a prompt to the user that says, look, there's something here that you probably should consider might require security. Those sorts of things are built into the user experience. But again, it sort of comes back to that policies piece, your email policy, and ensuring that you're just thinking about the nature of what you're dealing with, the data, the type of data. I'm afraid these days in a digital world, it's just become an entire topic in itself, which is why, as I say, trying to make sure you've got a real grasp of your processes and what information is passing outside the perimeter, the safe haven, if you like, of your business, and what's coming back the other way. So yeah, absolutely, it's feasible to configure the system to take up some of that, use technology to try and take some of that pain away as a norm.
And Paul, what's your view of using the Outlook app on mobile devices from a security perspective, I guess is the point of the question.
I think this actually largely comes down to the underlying tech infrastructure you've got on that back end. Again, you'll find these days that apps like the Outlook app, I actually use that on my mobile phone. And again, obviously it's hooked into my core email systems. We're an Office 365 user, like many of us I suspect are. And those systems enable you to use those peripheral devices with software that can then encrypt the connections between the device remotely and your home territory. It still means that you need to think, I mean, you'll probably be aware that within the Office 365 suite, there are various security buttons and that you can click on, and at a cost to lift the level of security associated with your infrastructure. They tend not these days to focus around that aspect of identity, actually. It's more about employing what they call TLS security, which is sort of negotiated. Quite often when we're dealing with our customers, our suppliers, we don't get the luxury of being able to check or mutually check our systems are able to talk to each other in a secure manner. So we're trying to provide systems that mean you don't have to take on the burden of that. The system automatically overlays security, let's say ES256 encryption, and it will do so via your Outlook app or via any external device if you're using a gateway on your back-end infrastructure. So again, important to get some good advice around ensuring those things are configured. And MailLock again can cope with those sorts of devices. Most of the traffic at a consumer level these days is being read whilst people are on the move, and no big surprise again. So it's important that those mediums are covered.
Grand. One question around phishing emails. Do we alert people inside the target company that they're likely to have a phishing simulation exercise take place? And the answer is that usually, the answer is usually yes. Because if staff don't know when a phishing email simulation attack is going to be made, they just simply know that one is going to be made sometime over the course of the next month or 6 weeks, they're going to stay in a state of heightened awareness, which might mean that they'll spot some of the ones which are not simulated attacks, they'll spot some of the real ones as well, which is kind of what you really want. You've got to remember that the volume of phishing attacks is huge. It's not as though, as an organization, you're only going to get one attack every 6 or 8 weeks. You're having phishing email attacks mounted against you either on an automated or a targeted basis on an hourly basis. So having people in a permanent state of awareness is a sensible thing to do. So the answer to that question is a definite yes. Tell people. We do it internally. We tell people, you never know when the thing that you're looking at is a test or the real thing. So just make sure you're paying attention. Bigger question, which is probably a good way to finish our time. The environmental costs are moving to an increasingly online world that come out of the COP26 sessions. What resources would we recommend for businesses wanting to reduce or offset their carbon footprints in relation to moving online? And I'm going to just make one suggestion and then let Paul finish off. And my one suggestion is get on with moving online as fast as you can. You'll be amazed how, if you insist on everybody working from home, you suddenly find you don't need nearly as much paper, nearly as big a carbon footprint, nearly as much, hey, just about anything as you did. If you insist on finding digital solutions to everything, signing, storing, all of the things that you did using traditional methods back in the office, you'll find you very quickly gets to the point at which your digital transformation has been significant. What you need to be paying a lot of attention to in that digital transformation process is cybersecurity in your infrastructure and inside your processes, because it's digital transformation that has enabled attackers to have a field day. They've taken advantage of people who've been transforming as quickly as they can, but without paying adequate attention to cybersecurity. Paul, what would you like to say on the subject?
I guess only that it's interesting that quite a few of the cloud services providers are really now focusing on this topic. I mean, I can certainly say we're an Azure, Windows, Microsoft Azure hosted environment, and part of our reason to select that environment was that Microsoft have been carbon neutral for some years. I think they're aiming to be net negative by, I believe it's 2035. Don't hold me to that date, but and then there's an awful lot of talk about offsetting. You know, again, people have told me about the fact that offsetting, there aren't actually enough, there's not enough space in the world to plant enough trees to do the amount of offsetting that people are talking about. So an awful lot of greenwashing going on. But you know, there is no doubt, you know, digitalisation is you know, it's been coming at us, it's been happening around us for decades. It's accelerating. COVID at home working has done that further. If you can try and use use systems and sources that are really making the right efforts to try and make themselves carbon cognitive, as it were. And as I say, the paper piece for us, you know, when we started looking at the stats around that, it's quite extraordinary. One of the companies we deal with at a strategic level, they print 8 billion pieces of paper a year, quite extraordinary, 2.4 billion packs a year. That's for the financial services, utilities and telco companies. And it feels a bit of a turkey voting for Christmas conversation. You know, why would a company like that want to digitize? Well, they sort of have to. Everybody, particularly with COP26, there's as much compulsion around reporting and the stats they've got to hit on this stuff. But I actually genuinely think customers, our consumers, they want this. You know, it's been driven at a consumer level. Certainly when my kids come home and talk about the subject, you know, every day, I don't want a legacy that is not playing to those themes. So I think we're all going to be involved in it and try and do what you can to play your part in that digital culture, but protect yourself on the journey.
Grand. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our hour together today. So on behalf of both Paul and I, on behalf of Beyond Encryption IT Governance, thank you all for being with us today. I hope it's been useful. Please do reach out to both of us for the different ways in which we can help you grapple with the need to improve security in today's hybrid working environments. We will be sending the slides out, as I said, earlier. We'll be sending them out to everybody later on over the course of the next 24 hours or so. And we look forward to you joining us either on a future webinar or even better, serving you in terms of helping you be more secure. Thank you all for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.